Ever wondered what real ancient warfare looked like, beyond the chaotic Hollywood armies crashing together on screen? Today, we're putting 10 of the most epic movie battles under the microscope, using expert commentary, animated maps, and battle diagrams to expose what's accurate and what's pure fantasy, which movie got Roman formations right, and which one turned history into a special effects circus. Get ready to see if your favorite war scenes stand up to the real tactics, or if Hollywood's just winging it. Does every epic movie battle give you déjà vu? You know the ones. Blinding walls of soldiers, shields held just right, everyone standing in perfect rows like they got the world's best drill sergeant, and that pulsing soundtrack that makes you want to grab a broom and charge. As soon as these scenes hit the screen, you can almost hear the director in the background, yelling for everyone to look menacing and not scratch their noses. But let's put the Hollywood magic on pause and talk about how real armies actually got ready for war. Would ancient soldiers really hit the field looking like synchronized swimmers? Or is this all a massive case of movie directors getting a little too obsessed with symmetry? First, think about what you're really seeing. A bird's-eye view swooping over endless lines of warriors, all of them facing the right way, helmets polished, banners flying high. It feels more like the opening ceremony for the ancient world's snazziest parade than the start of a bloody brawl. Directors love this for good reason. It packs a visual punch and makes you think something huge is about to go down. But for the folks actually fighting in those times, this level of camera-ready drama was pretty unlikely. Real ancient battlefields were organized, but only to a point. Take the Romans or the Greeks, for instance. Historical sources tell us these armies did try to line up, with soldiers clustered by type, infantry here, cavalry over there, archers way in the back. But if you expect everyone to snap into place like the world's most dangerous marching band, think again. Most armies were made up of people dragged off their farms or out of their villages. Some had barely seen a sword up close, let alone survived endless rounds of drilling. If you've ever been in a school assembly or watched a little league team try to form a straight line, you've already got a taste of the struggle. Imagine scaling that up to 10 or 20,000 sweaty, nervous people, many of whom are related by blood or by debt, and probably already wondering where their lunch is. And the soundtrack? You can thank movie composers for all those ominous drums and chanting choirs. It did pump up the tension, but in reality, ancient armies were more likely to sound like a combination of shouted orders, clanging weapons, and random farm boys whispering last-minute prayers. Some armies, like the Greeks, did have musicians, flute players or trumpeters, helping set the tempo for a charge or keeping everyone in step. But you wouldn't get anything close to the background music blasting through movie theaters. If there was a rhythm to war, it was probably broken up by the thud of boots in mud and the roar of commanders yelling to keep the lines straight. Now, let's talk about those arm-long rows of discipline you see on screen. In movies, it looks like an army could line up forever, everyone perfectly aware of what's about to happen. The camera pans across, and somehow, every soldier has not only fantastic posture, but also the exact same terrified expression. But actual historical reports are a lot less glamorous. For example, the Greek historian Xenophon described his mercenary army struggling just to stay halfway organized, especially when nerves or confusion made them stumble out of place. These weren't trained actors, they were real people jockeying for position, elbowing each other when the commander wasn't looking, and often getting pushed off to a spot they didn't want. What about the Romans, the masters of discipline according to every movie ever made? Let's say you're watching a scene where Romans form up in those famous checkerboard patterns, armor shining, shields raised. Sure, the legions trained hard, but even the best soldiers tripped, fell, or wandered out of line, especially once they saw the enemy getting closer. Not every Roman could read the general's signals or hear the exact moment to advance. Add a little fear, a lot of dust, and the urge to survive, and those neat blocks of troops started to wobble before the battle even began. Here's a fun tidbit. Movies often show armies as impossibly massive. It's not rare to see what looks like hundreds of thousands of soldiers stretching over the horizon. But reality puts a hard limit on these numbers. For most of ancient history, if you cobbled together an army of 10,000, you were already working overtime. Caesar would crow about facing armies 2 or 3 times as big as his own, but even he couldn't wrangle the kind of headcounts you see in modern Hollywood blockbusters. More bodies mean more food, more water, and more problems, none of which are cheap or easy to solve when your main mode of transport is a tired donkey. So, why the gigantic numbers? It looks impressive. If you film 200 extras from 20 creative angles, suddenly you've got an army that would make any ancient king jealous. Let's not forget about what these armies were actually doing while waiting for battle. In the movies, troops just sort of stand there, weapons ready, quietly scowling until someone gives the signal to charge. But ancient sources frequently mention the opposite. Nervous chatter, fiddling with gear, some soldiers searching for lost sandals. There's a reason writers like Herodotus complained about the confusion before a fight. Being too still or too calm would probably get you mistaken for a statue. The chaos before an actual battle is almost impossible to fake, even for the best actors under perfect lighting. Most troops didn't have the patience, let alone the discipline, to look epic on command. Let's zoom in on some of those dramatic, slow-motion marches directors adore. Yes, moving as a big group could make an army look powerful, but the real challenge was keeping everyone moving at the same pace, in the same direction, and not trampling the unlucky soldier who tripped on his own shield. Even getting a single formation to advance in good order was considered a win. Imagine shoving thousands of tired, sweating people in armor onto an uneven field, everyone's vision blocked, dust rising everywhere, the fear of what's ahead tightening every stomach. Marching in slow motion for dramatic effect was the least of their worries. And how about those flags and banners, flapping in the fake wind under perfect sunlight? Those had an actual military use, letting generals and soldiers figure out where their friends were on the battlefield. Visual cues were more useful than any drumbeat or shouted command, since most soldiers couldn't hear much of anything in the noise and confusion. But the tidy ranks you see in movies, everyone moving together just because a flag waves? In practice, plenty of troops spent the battle straining to see if that banner belonged to their own side or someone else, and not everybody got it right either. Another thing to keep in mind is the difference between professional soldiers and the kind of recruits most armies counted on. Movies rarely show the mix of ages, experience, and backgrounds in real units. You'd have teenagers fighting next to grizzled veterans, famers still wearing a bit of last season's mud beside proud city boys in hand-me-down armor. Getting all of them to stand still and look tough for more than a few minutes? Forget about it. When the going got tough, lines curled, troops bunched up wherever they thought it was safer, and the neat rectangles seen from above vanished in minutes. Directors also stretched the idea of a clean battlefield. Those tabletop perfect green fields don't match many actual combat zones, which were often rocky, muddy, or chopped up by hedges, trees, and old buildings. Keeping neat lines was almost impossible unless you spent a week cutting down half the countryside. If an army did have time to clear space, it usually happened long before any dramatic close-up. Visuals take over again here. Nothing ruins an epic moment in a movie like trying to choreograph horse charges around sheep or jumping over piles of last year's manure. So, are these detailed formations purely fiction? Not always. There were cases when discipline really did pay off. Some ancient armies, usually the better-trained elites, managed to hold lines and impress with their order. But that depended on steady nerves, clear communication, and good leaders. One distraction, a loud noise, or the surprise appearance of the enemy's cavalry, and even the best-trained troops could find themselves tangled up and fighting for basic survival rather than holding their spot. In the end, while Hollywood loves to show armies lined up like action figures ready for the big moment, the on-the-ground reality was far messier, much less predictable, and a lot more chaotic. Instead of one smooth, intimidating wave, think smaller clumps of people busy, trying not to mess up, all while glancing nervously at their neighbors or the nearest officer. None of this made for easy camera work, but it sure got closer to what really happened. The next time you see a movie open with a sea of perfect lines and synchronized slow-motion marching, remember, with thousands of soldiers, each thinking about their own problems and looking for someone to follow, those picture-perfect formations are more fantasy than fact. And speaking of keeping everyone in line, wait till you see what happens when the Romans take the spotlight and try to hold it all together. Let's talk about Roman soldiers, the guys Hollywood loves to show as the gold standard of discipline. In every sword and sandal epic, legionaries line up in perfect checkerboard rows, faces locked in stoic frowns, shields squared, sandals practically clicking in time. But if you've ever watched one of these battles, you know what happens next. The camera zooms in, someone screams, swords come out, and suddenly everyone is fighting like it's rush hour at a Roman market. What happened to all that teamwork and crisp order? Did Roman battles really fall apart into chaos the second things got heated? Or is that just Hollywood's way of making a brawl look dramatic? In real life, Rome's military reputation didn't grow out of luck, fancy costumes, or gladiator muscles. It grew out of something much less movie-friendly. Endless drills, strict group discipline, and a set of battle formations that turned armies into well-oiled machines, not random crowds with swords. But here's where movies hit a snag. It's much easier to shoot a wild, muddy free-for-all than to capture a bunch of armored men moving and turning together, every step planned and every gap watched. Plus, it gives the big-name stars a chance to show off their sword skills. Never mind that, in reality, most fighting wasn't about one-on-one heroics. Roman formations were anything but simple. Early Roman battles used a setup called the Manipular Legion, broken into three main lines: the hastati up front, the more seasoned principes in the middle, and the grizzled veterans, the triarii, bringing up the rear. Think of it as a layered defense. Fresh legs start things off, more experienced soldiers take over once things get rough, and the old-timers come in to either save the day or cover the retreat. Of course, there were also the velites, light infantry, who had the very exciting job of running out front to throw javelins and then sprinting back to safety before getting caught. Every Hollywood movie that shows Romans starting in neat blocks but then randomly mixing with the enemy skips one big point. These lines weren't meant to dissolve at the first sign of trouble. They were supposed to flex, meaning groups moved forward, fell back, or swapped places as the battle changed, while keeping formation whenever humanly possible. The genius of this setup wasn't just about neatness. It was flexibility. The Manipular Legion could respond to changes on the field by shuffling units around like pieces on a chessboard. So while the Hastati were butting heads with the enemy, the Principes could be waiting for their moment. If things went sideways, the triarii would step up. The idea was to avoid the classic problem you see in movies. One line collapses, and suddenly it's every man for himself. That old system worked well, but by Caesar's time, the Romans had upgraded again. They now used cohorts, larger blocks of around 500 men, each made up of 6 smaller units called centuries. This system let the army move as big blocks or smaller groups, depending on what the commander needed. Movies rarely show this, probably because it's tricky to choreograph hundreds of background actors pretending to react to invisible orders. In truth, the cohort system allowed for the rapid adjustment to changing situations. Commanders could pull units back, send in reinforcements, or swing a cohort to one side if trouble was brewing, all while keeping some sense of order. And what about keeping soldiers together when all you want to do is run away, chase loot, or whack whichever moving shadow is closest? The Romans beat this with relentless training and some creative motivation. Military life was strict, bordering on ruthless. Roman soldiers practiced the basics, forming up, advancing, swapping with tired soldiers in the front, closing gaps, until it became automatic. There was a rule for nearly everything, from how fast you marched to how you swapped shields with the guy next to you if someone dropped theirs. Slip up, you risked punishment, sometimes harsh, and sometimes just plain humiliating. The Roman word for group spirit was esprit de corps, the pride and loyalty men felt for their own cohort or century. Loyalty was to the Roman state, but pride was based in the soldier's unit, and heaven helped the guy who embarrassed his group in front of the banner. It wasn't just about psychology, though. Roman equipment was built for working in formation. Forget those dramatic, over-the-shoulder slashes the movies love. Real legionaries favored quick, controlled stabs with the gladius, a short sword that was deadly in close quarters, but pretty useless once things got tangled. Their shields, called scutum, fit together like overlapping doors, allowing legionaries to block attacks while still moving as a team. They even had special armor, lorica segmentata, which looked a bit like an ancient version of a segmented turtle shell. All of it was perfect for group fighting. The point was to survive by sticking together, not by breaking formation for flashy duels. Now, keeping track of who was friend or foe in the chaos, more complicated than any movie lets on. Every legion had its standards, distinctive banners topped with shiny eagles or discs. You stuck close to your standard, both for honor and because, in battle, it was your only clue where you belonged. If someone dropped the standard or wandered away, it caused real panic. No GPS, no colored smoke, just flags, word of mouth, and blind trust you hadn't wandered into the wrong crowd. Plus, armor and shields often had unit-specific markings or colors. When the dust settled on the field, if you weren't sure, the sensible move was to shout and hope for a Latin response before you stabbed someone by mistake. Let's check how this really played out on film. The series Rome got surprising bits right. They showed the front rank switching out tired men, so the formation stayed fresh, and legionaries fighting in close, coordinated groups. That's closer to real life, where even when chaos loomed, soldiers worked to keep order. But go watch Spartacus, the 1960 version. You'll see those mighty legions march in looking spectacular, crisp lines, banners waving, shield walls gleaming. By the halfway point, it's a confused melee, every formation tossed away for dramatic brawling. In reality, that wild pile-up never matched the true Roman playbook, which relied on order, not raw chaos. What about teamwork once things got hot? In a word, relentless. Training focused on instilling group cohesion, making sure every legionary moved, fought, and even retreated as part of a unit. In battle, Roman military training focused on instilling group cohesion, or esprit de corps, which bound the men together into effective fighting units. So, there were no bonus points for jumping out ahead or racking up the most flashy moves. Each century and cohort worked like a miniature team, covering advances, plugging leaks in the line, and withdrawing together when things got ugly. The enemy might try to break the formation, scatter the ranks, or pick off outliers, but as long as the Romans could reform or fall back in organized groups, they had a chance to turn things around. If you're wondering how any human being held it together with dust in their eyes, the smell of sweat and metal everywhere, and a wall of enemy shields just a few feet away, well, so did the Romans. But that's what years of training, peer pressure, and the looming threat of your officer's wrath achieved. In the heat of battle, soldiers clung to order because their lives depended on it. You'll never see a line in a movie where a Roman shouts, "Everyone back to their places." But that's exactly what kept things from spiraling out of control. Real Roman tactics were a team sport, not a free-for-all. Next time you watch a movie where those stunning blocks of soldiers break formation at the first sign of chaos, you'll know why history was a lot less like a barroom brawl and a lot more like a deadly dance. One that could only work if no one tried to steal the spotlight. And speaking of spotlights, let's see how the Greeks handled their own version of keep it together, especially when things really started flying. If a movie shows a Greek phalanx, you'd think nothing could break it. Lines of hoplites, shields overlapping, spears poking out like a porcupine on parade, marching straight toward the enemy. Hollywood loves this image, a wall of muscle and bronze, moving as one, unstoppable until someone yells cut. It's like the ultimate group project, where no one can slack off, everyone keeps their place, and together they turn into a giant human tank, rolling right over the bad guys. But the truth, the shield wall wasn't as foolproof as the movies would have you believe. Let's take this movie fantasy and start poking at it, right where it squeaks. You already know how Hollywood starts these scenes. The camera pulls back, dramatic music swells, and a block of Greeks appears out of the dust, pushing forward in step. Shields flare, spears rattle, and there's this aura of invincibility. The whole front row is like one continuous shield, and every spear is pointed in exactly the same direction, glinting in the sun. On screen, no one ever drops anything, and nobody has to shout over the noise. Sure, it looks cool, but the movie version skips past the fact that in real life, keeping that wall tight took work, a lot of it. These soldiers weren't born knowing how to stick together and keep formation, especially when 1,000 things could go wrong at any second. Talk about tension. Let's get one thing straight. The Greek phalanx worked because the hoplites, think citizen soldiers, not just full-time pros, practiced together. They stood close enough for shields to overlap, each one covering the left of his neighbor. It was the classical version of trusting your buddy with your lunch money and your life. The guy on the end, though, always got the short straw because his right side was exposed. In any army, someone always pulls the risky spot. If hoplites lost focus or got tired, a gap could open, and one small hole was all it took for the enemy to shove through. Now imagine trying to hold that line with arrows raining down, dust stinging your eyes, and the guy behind you shoving so hard you can barely breathe. But movies rarely show what happened before the lines met. Instead, you get eye candy of shields clashing and heroes yelling, "Hold the line." What they don't tell you, the phalanx was vulnerable to flanking maneuvers, attacks on uneven terrain, and the effects of missile fire, which could inflict casualties before the melee even began. That's not just nitpicking. If you were down in the dirt, holding your shield, hearing arrows zip by, it was a lot less Olympian and a lot more terrifying. And if your formation got hit from the side, say goodbye. Even legendary phalanxes broke up fast once the line wobbled or started to curl away from a strong attack. All of a sudden, your perfect wall turned into a panicked mob. Here's the good news bad news bit. In head-on collisions, the phalanx rocked. Against Persians or anyone less organized, the Greeks sometimes stomped the competition. That's why Herodotus's accounts of the Greco-Persian Wars illustrate the phalanx's effectiveness against less organized opponents. If everyone moved together, kept pace, and trusted each other, the enemy would get steamrolled, or at least have a very bad day. But you can't always pick your battlefield. Most movie scenes ignore this, placing the phalanx on wide, flat plains, nothing but open ground for miles. Ancient Greece wasn't a golf course. Hills, rocks, rivers, these things happened, and a phalanx had no stair mode. You hit a bad patch, the whole formation would buckle. If you tripped, the guy next to you tripped, and suddenly the world's strongest wall had a giant dent in it. Let's talk about what the shield wall actually did. The shield wall provided significant protection against projectiles and melee attacks. It was not a perfect defense. That's big. Movies sometimes treat shields like invincible force fields. In reality, they covered a lot, but didn't block everything, especially as the formation moved. Raise a shield too high to block arrows. You opened yourself up to getting poked from below. Hold it low, and you might take a spear to the face. Experience helped, but luck had an opinion, too. Soldiers made it work by following the hoplite next to them, trusting the formation, and hoping no one in the front row got a sudden urge for heroics. Now, this is where Hollywood likes to turn up the drama. You'll see the phalanx looking solid, everyone braced for impact, and then suddenly a hero, let's call him Achilles, shoots forward, leaping over his buddies, and launches into a wild duel. It's great for the plot, awful for the survival rate. If someone did that in a real fight, most ancient generals would have fired Achilles on day one. It's not just bad manners, it's suicidal. The point of a phalanx was that nobody got to be the solo star. If someone broke the line and left a gap, it risked the safety of everyone, not just their own skin. The only way to win was to work together. A group project you absolutely couldn't skip. Animated diagrams make this pretty simple when you see them side by side. Hollywood version. Shields make a flat, glowing wall. Everyone moves like a school of fish, and the only disruptions are to show off the main character's bravery. Real version. Shields sometimes slip, lines curve, there's jostling when someone bumps you from behind, and missile fire can cut holes before swords even get close. There's also the constant worry about the flanks, the outer edges of the formation, because if you didn't guard those, enemy cavalry or faster troops could swing around and attack from the side. Once that happened, it was chaos. A few warriors tried to turn, but that just made a bigger mess, and pretty soon it was every hoplite for himself. From an expert's angle, the effectiveness of the shield wall depended on the soldiers' ability to maintain their formation and cover each other effectively. Lose the bond, lose the battle. If the lines started splitting apart, even for a second, an opponent could force their way through, swinging the momentum in an instant. Confidence in the phalanx mattered just as much as armor or weapons. Any soldier trying to break off for solo glory wasn't winning the day. They were starting a stampede. To bring it back to Hollywood, filmmakers love a good solo charge, a leader racing out while everyone watches. But the phalanx punished individual heroics. Generals didn't want show-offs. They wanted team players. The hoplite in the front was counting on every shield at his side, and the guy in the rear needed to keep pace, not sneak out for a close-up. If Achilles tried his movie moves for real, the only thing he'd get was a lecture and a fast ticket home. So, when you watch the next epic phalanx scene, keep an eye on the wall itself. If everyone stays put and holds firm, they might just stand a chance. But the minute the formation breaks for a star turn or someone leaps out for a dramatic duel, know that in real history, that battle's about to go downhill fast. With the shield wall, it wasn't about the glory. It was about not getting everyone else trampled. And the Greeks were dead serious about keeping their lines together. Now, if you want to know why movies keep showing heroes charging into duels, as if thousands of watching soldiers are happy to hit pause on the mayhem, just wait till you see how the hero versus champion idea holds up. Every time a Hollywood battle breaks out, you know what's coming. Music swells. The camera closes in on one lone hero, and suddenly, it's like the director hit the pause button for everyone else. The noise of thousands of fighters quiets, and the hero charges out for a dramatic duel with the enemy champion. For a few minutes, there's no mud, no chaos, just two VIPs circling each other in some open patch of ground while the world seems to hold its breath. It's a formula as old as movie making, from Troy to Gladiator, and pretty much every sword-clanking blockbuster in between. But ask yourself, did this kind of one-on-one showdown actually happen on ancient battlefields? Did thousands really stand back, so two guys could fight to the death for the sake of plot development? Hollywood didn't invent the idea of the superstar warrior. The myth goes all the way back to Homer's Iliad, a story packed with dueling champions, each one strutting out for their big moment. There's a reason movies copy that style. Pick one face in the crowd, put all the hopes of the army on his shoulders, let the audience invest, and boom, instant drama. But the contrast between the individual combat emphasized in Homeric epics and the more pragmatic realities of historical warfare highlights this cinematic tendency. The Greeks in Homer's stories might stop the battle, while Achilles and Hector yell at each other. But by the time real armies started fighting in the thousands, things had changed in a big way. Let's talk about the wishful thinking factor first. You want clear heroes and villains in a movie, not a mass of anonymous helmets. A duel gives you a simple narrative, but on a real battlefield, it's like trying to sprint across a football field while the stands suddenly throw their food at you. The noise, the panic, the pure messiness of combat, none of it faded away just because two big names squared off for a sword fight. As soon as an army was big enough that soldiers couldn't all hear the same order at the same time, controlling the chaos became the real challenge, not encouraging solo performances. Hollywood's love affair with champion duels didn't stop at the Greeks, either. Roman and medieval stories are full of similar moments, sometimes inspired by poems and legends, more than actual military records. The film Troy, 2004, throws this into high gear. You get wild one-on-one combats framed by armies standing around like they paid for ringside tickets. The director got both things on screen, some of the most exciting mass combat scenes and individual duels ever put on film. But here's the truth. Cramming a personal showdown into a massed battle usually means ignoring what the fighting was actually like. And modern historians, they spot the problem right away. The depiction of ancient battles in Hollywood often prioritizes individual heroics, such as duels between champions, over the realities of massed warfare, creating a dramatic effect that can overshadow historical accuracy. By the time the first ranks clashed, any pause to let the all-stars fight would probably have been drowned out by shields banging, men shouting orders, and the thud of people who tripped and landed on someone's foot. Still, if you dig into ancient texts, there are bits of truth hiding in there. In early small-scale skirmishes, or before the main event started, a duel between champions sometimes did happen, for show, for morale, or even to try to end a fight before it escalated. But that was mainly before armies ballooned in size, and before formations got complex. Once armies fought in lines 10 men deep and hundreds wide, nobody was going to put their swords down to watch two guys hash it out. The reason is simple: self-preservation. Even the bravest warriors generally wanted to go home in one piece, and stopping to cheer for someone else's duel while you were being pelted by arrows or shoved from behind didn't make sense. There's a hidden cost, too, in the myth of the solo champion. We love watching Maximus slice through gladiators in Gladiator, or seeing a hero in slow motion, blood and dirt flying. These moments give the audience something to root for. The focus on individual prowess and heroism is a key element of the modern myth of war, which prioritizes clear character arcs and emotional engagement over the more mundane realities of combat. It's a trade-off, really. The battle becomes a backdrop for personal glory, when the historical reality was closer to organized chaos, with soldiers hoping not to get separated or whacked by a stray sword. To really see how this works, imagine launching a duel in the middle of a clashing phalanx. Hoplites were packed together like sardines. Nobody had the room to swing a sword without elbowing their buddy in the face. And let's say you wanted to challenge the enemy champion. You'd have to step out in front of your own line, hoping your side didn't follow in case they thought you were running away. Plus, you risked becoming target practice for enemy archers, or just getting pulled down by a few bored spearmen who didn't care about the rules. Some movies try to split the difference. Gladiator loves showcasing Russell Crowe fighting to the last breath in the arena, but when it comes time for the big open field battles, the focus shifts, at least a little, to Roman discipline and team effort. The individual story lets us cheer for a hero, but the film does not overshadow the broader context of the Roman military. If you watch closely, even in Gladiator's big opening battle, the camera keeps cutting back to the big picture. The individual heroism is never far, but you also see lines of troops moving, archers firing in tandem, cavalry sweeping in. It's a reminder. The magic of the duel is only part of the story. To hammer this point home, let's pull up a diagram of a historical battlefield, say, from the Persian Wars or one of Rome's big clashes. Pop-up facts spill out. Ranks 10 deep, gaps barely wide enough for a man to slip through, and battlefield dust so thick you couldn't see a hero half the time anyway. Animated overlays reveal the tempo. A solid line holds, feet shuffling forward, and the front ranks get swapped out over and over as soldiers tire. Nobody steps gracefully into the open for a monologue or a quick one-on-one. Most would be lucky to spot their own hands, let alone the famous face on the other side. What about the movies that kick off a fight with the classic Champions Challenge? Sure, Troy plays with the legend, but even there, after the first few duels, you get the real storm. No time for speeches, just fast, brutal fighting. Any hope for ceremony goes out the window the second armies get close. The real winner, as usual, is survival, being smart, working together, and hoping luck or skill, or both get you through. But why do movies keep rolling out the hero duel card? Because it works. Story-wise, anyway, it gives the audience a break from the faceless crowd and lets directors showcase a moment of high drama. There's an easy payoff, make it personal and people care. But it's all about the myth, not the mud. This focus on one-on-one combat is a common cinematic trope designed to generate excitement, but it frequently clashes with historical accounts that suggest such duels were less prevalent during large-scale engagements, where the chaos of battle left little room for staged showdowns. In the real mud of battle, you couldn't count on dramatic timing or a respectful break in the violence for a sword fight between celebrities. Occasionally, ancient armies would agree to single combat before a fight started, especially in disputes between rival kings or chiefs. The idea was to avoid the bloodshed of a real battle by letting the outcome be decided by a single brave soul. But even then, both sides had to trust the other to keep their word, and more often than not, this still led to fighting when the loser's side got angry and jumped in. Codes of honor sound great in epic poetry, but blood, nerves, and bad tempers often won out. It's also worth noting that as warfare grew more professional, think organized phalanxes, Roman legions, and later medieval armies, officials and officers actively discouraged individual duels. Any slip in teamwork put the whole unit at risk, whether from the enemy or from friendly confusion. You see the same thing in cavalry charges or shield walls. Any one person who broke ranks stood a real chance of getting themselves and their neighbors killed. So the next time you watch a movie and see the hero gallop solo into no man's land to face the enemy champion, remember, it's tailor-made for the big screen, but not for survival. In history, you won by sticking close, listening for orders, and keeping your heroics in check until it was safe to brag about them later, preferably after cleaning the mud off your sandals. Meanwhile, with all these bodies crushed together and mayhem flying in every direction, another problem crops up. How did anybody, let alone a champion, keep track of who was actually on their side once the chaos erupted? When confusion reigned and friend looked a lot like foe, the results could get ugly, fast. Ever squinted at the chaos of a movie battle, wondering how anybody keeps track of who's on which side? You're not alone. Ancient soldiers faced this kind of confusion for real, and for them, it wasn't just about getting lost in the action. Mistaking a friend for an enemy could mean the difference between getting a hero's welcome or ending up face first in the mud, because someone on your own team panicked. It's the opposite of a schoolyard game, where you can just pause and check who's wearing red. Ancient battlefields set the stage for a mess so tangled that even the sharpest warrior had a tough time knowing who not to smack with a sword. Movies would rather you didn't worry about any of this. Hollywood loves a tidy clash, usually with armies color-coded for your viewing pleasure. One side in bright, matching armor, shiny silver or bold red, and the other bunch decked out in menacing dark tones or battered leather, so you always know who to root for. It's the action movie version of labeling your food with a marker, so nobody gets confused at lunch. Sometimes, films even go the extra mile, lining up the good guys and bad guys like it's a really savage team photo day. But in truth, armies in the past usually looked a lot more like a random mix from the world's scrappiest thrift store. Ordinary soldiers often wore whatever they could afford, borrowed, or begged from their neighbors, sometimes all at once. Talk about fashion disasters. Let's look at Troy, a classic example where the Trojans look perfectly organized, matching crests and spotless lines, while the Greeks are a jumble, shadowed and messy. It makes for easy storytelling, villain versus hero, by way of costume design. But real battlefields didn't come with those director's notes or a handy color wheel. Ancient fights were more, where's Waldo? Then chessboard, except, instead of striped shirts, you had battered shields, mismatched helmets, and the constant risk of getting jabbed in the back by someone who couldn't tell if you were an ally or a threat. This is where things get wild. If you were drafted into battle back then, your world shrank to the patch of ground right around you. That was your whole universe, what you could see, reach, or yell at. Soldiers were primarily focused on their own survival, and the survival of those immediately around them, which limited their ability to assess the overall situation or relay information about events elsewhere on the battlefield. The big, sweeping tactics you see with generals waving their arms on cliffs are mostly movie invention. Most warriors couldn't look up without risking a broken nose. The only things they trusted were the faces and voices next to them, maybe a battered flag or two, and the distant shout of their commander, assuming they could even hear it above the noise. So, how did ancient armies try to keep confusion from crushing them? Well, there was no factory-churned uniform ready for pickup before the big fight. Instead, they relied on a mix of tricks, banners, standards, and the loudest person in the group. Armies would hoist sticks topped with eagles, animals, or whatever symbol the bosses thought looked impressive. Sometimes, colors or curtains tied to spears. You didn't need to see every part of the battlefield, just needed to fix your eyes on your group's marker. If you lost sight of the standard, you were in trouble. It was the only clue where you belonged. That little flag or eagle became your version of a GPS, way before anyone could even dream up satellites. But keeping lines straight and banners visible was another game altogether. In movies, lines of troops hold up forever. Real life looked more like a rush at a packed concert the moment someone opens the doors. People bunched together, drifted sideways, or tripped and disappeared under a pile of feet. Maintaining a clear battle line was also crucial, as any gaps or enemies behind the line could lead to a breakdown in order and a potential retreat. That's why you hear old stories of panicky retreats or whole armies bolting for safety. As soon as the line broke or an enemy popped up behind the main group, confusion spread faster than word at a neighborhood gossip session. Nobody wanted to be the last one to realize they were surrounded, or worse, alone. Animated reenactments put this mess into perspective. Picture a mass of bodies, all pushing and fumbling in a cloud of dust and sweat. If the line cracks, soldiers in the back can't see where the break started, So rumor and panic fly down the row. Someone shouts, "They're behind us!" And it doesn't matter if it's true. Fear moves people faster than orders ever could. Ancient records mention entire armies quitting the fight because someone thought the wrong group was winning. No time for hero speeches here. Just run and hope you're headed the right way. Distinguishing friend from foe was a critical challenge in the chaos of ancient battles, a factor often overlooked in cinematic depictions. The risk of friendly fire was more common than most movies show. If you see a helmet bobbing over a wall of dust, it's a coin toss, whether it belongs to your side or not. And there's no slow-mo zoom in reality to show a familiar face before you swing. Whole units might turn on each other by mistake, especially if the opponent wore or carried the same sort of shield or armor. As soon as the confusion started, friendly fire incidents could lead to panic and potentially trigger a confused retreat or even a rout. Losing your nerve could be contagious. One pair running could turn into a dozen, then 100, stampeding off the field. You don't see that in the movies much, but it happened so often. Ancient commanders lost more battles to panic than to enemy swords. To keep things under control, armies sometimes held back, leaving open no man's land between their lines, just enough buffer that the first ones to clash at least knew which way to face. A few careful commanders kept their soldiers arranged with enough breathing room to spot the enemy's approach. Ancient armies employed various methods, including maintaining distance or establishing a no man's land between opposing forces. When armies marched out, the difference between a hold-the-line moment and complete chaos often came down to a handful of sharp eyes and louder-than-average sergeants. Standards and signals were there to help, but nothing was foolproof. Movies love quick fixes like blowing horns or waving flags, but on real battlefields, the use of standards, colors, and signals were also used to help soldiers identify allies and relay commands. Easy to imagine until fog hits, or smoke from burning gear drifts through, or the enemy takes your standard down and waves it as bait. Confusion grows by the minute, and it's the oldest military trick in the book. Take your opponent's banner to trick them into thinking they're surrounded, and watch order dissolve into chaos. If you want a portrayal that gets closer to the real mess, check out HBO's Rome. Unlike the usual hero-of-the-minute routine, the series shows soldiers trying to keep their lines, listening for commands, and fighting as a team. The real twist is what happens when someone gets clever or scared and steps out of line. Not a star moment, just a liability. A soldier who broke formation was treated as a nuisance rather than a hero, and you can watch discipline hold everything together until one misstep starts unraveling the whole row. That's not the stuff of movie sheet music, but it's a lot closer to how things worked or fell apart. The downside of all this disorder? Ancient commanders spent as much energy fighting confusion as they did the enemy. That's why they drilled their armies like mad, lining up, practicing turns, learning who they were supposed to stand with. And for all the talk about legendary discipline, everyone from Greeks to Romans to medieval knights lost fights because panic spread from one corner to the next. Even Caesar, a general with no shortage of swagger, saw more than one battlefield turn into a disaster because his men confused each other for enemies at the worst possible moment. The lack of clear visual distinctions, such as uniforms or standardized armor, could easily lead to friendly fire incidents, causing panic and potentially triggering a confused retreat or even a rout. It's easy to watch a film where a general's bird's eye view lets him command perfect order like he's playing a strategy game. Real battles weren't like that. Soldiers slogged through smoke, dirt, shouting, and a sea of nearly identical faces. One flash of a metal crest or glimpse of a familiar banner might save you from trouble, or send you running if it was going the wrong direction. In the end, the real magic wasn't in shouting out your hero's name, but in sticking close, following the standard, and guessing right more times than you guessed wrong. The best armies understood the fog of war before anyone had names for it. They trusted training and hoped everyone stayed calm when the shouting started. So the next time you see a big screen clash where everyone seems to know exactly what they're doing, remember, most ancient battles ended not because one side triumphed with style, but because chaos took over and whole armies melted away in a tide of confusion. What happened next? Sometimes, the lucky ones ran back to camp to try again. Others vanished into history, all because one split second of uncertainty tipped the scales from order to panic. As for those soldiers in the thick of it, the ones squinting through dust and sweat, they weren't thinking about glory. They were simply hoping the person next to them was on their side. Now, let's pull back for a moment and talk about the warriors firing from a distance. The archers and artillery crews you see in almost every old school battle scene. Were they really the sharpshooters movies make them out to be? Or did friendly fire lurk behind every perfect arrow storm? If Hollywood is to be believed, ancient archers were basically walking sniper rifles. Light a few torches, line up those bowmen, and it's arrow rain time. The camera pans to slow-motion devastation. Enemy ranks fall, your own troops barely flinch, and not a single friendly helmet gets a scratch. It's a story directors can't resist. One volley turns the entire battlefield into a porcupine festival, and the home team just keeps marching forward, miraculously unharmed. But real archery on an ancient battlefield was a lot closer to controlled chaos than movie magic, and if you actually stood behind those archers, you'd spend more time worrying about where the arrows might land than admiring the view. So let's set aside the slow-mo heroics for a minute. What was really happening with ancient missile troops? In most movies, commanders wave their arms, archers loose their arrows, and everyone instantly scores a bullseye. Directors know exactly where to place the camera to catch that perfect arrow glinting in the sun before it lands between the enemy's eyes. The real challenge of ranged warfare, hitting the right people from hundreds of feet away while half-blind from sweat, gets left on the cutting room floor. Instead, the audience gets a bird's-eye view of flawless coordination and a guarantee that every shot counts. But ancient commanders and archers understood it was never that easy. For starters, accuracy was basically a game of chance. Ancient bows and arrows weren't engineered with computer technology or laser sights. Your everyday bow had enough quirks that a slight breeze could push your shot 2 feet off target, and the odds only got worse the farther you tried to shoot. If you think being an archer meant lining up for a perfect, jaw-dropping volley every time, you're giving ancient technology too much credit. Arrowheads were hand-forged, shafts slightly warped, and strings snapped or got wet and useless. The classic Hollywood Reign of Death looks great from a comfy theater seat, but try standing underneath it, and you'll realize pretty quickly that not all arrows followed instructions. Some movies never even hint at the struggle these missile troops faced. If you truly wanted to score a hit from 100 yards out, you needed a thick line of enemies, a bit of luck, and no wind, or better yet, a stationary wall or gate. Most of the time, volleys were less about picking off individuals and more about disrupting tightly packed enemy groups. Stray shots weren't rare, they were the rule. That's why historical sources hardly ever brag about archers pivoting battles single-handedly unless the enemy was packed together like sardines. Then there's the classic Hollywood setup. Archers firing over the heads of their own soldiers, their arrows only ever finding bad guys. Watch, try, and you get scene after scene of Greeks loosing arrows right over friendly lines as if invisible magnets steer everything to the right place. But that's dramatic fantasy, not sound military thinking. The idea of sending a random sky full of arrows over the heads of your own men would probably terrify any real veteran. As one historian put it about the actual risk, it is very likely that the men on the ground would actually be begging the guys on the walls to stop shooting because of the great risk that they would be hit. No soldier liked standing within range of a shaky-handed archer, let alone an entire row of them. Why was this such a big deal? Archers and artillery weren't robots. They only had a certain amount of control. Even if the front rank dropped to one knee, arrows could lose speed, dip early, or get blown off course, falling way short of the intended mark. This made firing over your own troops less a badge of confidence and more a mark of desperation. Commanders wanted those missile troops out where the damage would only land on the other guys, or, at the very least, not on their own shield mates. Positioning was a science, not a guessing game. If you pull up an animated map of an actual ancient battlefield, you'll spot archers and artillery crews tucked away on the flanks, spread out on nearby hills, or planted behind a safe distance from their main infantry line, not because they disliked action, but because keeping a buffer zone was the only way to avoid shooting their own people. These choices didn't just keep casualties down, they had a real impact on planning every move. That's why so many battles were chosen with terrain in mind. Hills, ridges, or bits of high ground gave missile troops an elevation boost and kept the odds of hitting your own side low. There's a reason the phrase, high ground, keeps popping up in historical records. Artillery, think catapults, ballistae, and their relatives, added another wrinkle. A big ancient missile device could hurl stones or bolts a lot farther than a standard bow, but it was even harder to hit anything accurately. And the slow reload time meant you had to choose your shots carefully, since missing could waste a big chunk of precious ammunition. It's easy for movies to set up those booming impacts right in the middle of the enemy line, but in real life, siege stones hit as much dirt and random clumps of grass as they did shields or helmets. Artillery was terrifying, but it was just as dangerous for your own side if a commander made a mistake with distance or elevation. Worse, the risk of misfiring wasn't just theoretical. Ancient texts and modern reconstructions show how often friendly fire turned victory into a disaster. There are accounts of commanders miscalculating a volley and peppering their own advancing troops, of arrows whipping sideways in strong winds and clipping the helmets of men who thought they were safe. Even the pros got caught off guard, Sometimes the very people who'd planned the arrow storm found their foot soldiers diving for cover. The need to avoid friendly fire often dictated the positioning of archers and artillery, influencing their effectiveness and the overall battle strategy. This wasn't just an embarrassment. It could tip a whole fight the wrong way. Environmental challenges only cranked up the difficulty. Wind gusts, unexpected rain, uneven ground, and the simple fact that everyone on the field was moving made well-timed, coordinated fire difficult to pull off. If you've ever tried pushing an umbrella into the wind or playing catch in a storm, you get the general idea. Add the pressure of enemy archers shooting back, and accuracy drops even lower. Some commanders chose to wait until the enemy was packed tight in a choke point, like crossing a river or funneling into a city gate, just so the odds of friendly fire fell, and every errant arrow at least had a chance at hitting something useful. Not every army prioritized archers or missile weapons either. Greeks, for example, often relied more on shield walls than arrow fire, partly for cultural reasons, but also because they didn't much trust even the trained archers to avoid own goals. Persians, on the other hand, used so many archers their strategy was just to fill the air and hope the math worked out. Romans took a middle road, using archers in support, but rarely risking them in tight spaces. Modern movies sometimes mash all this into a single inaccurate stew. Everyone seems to have Olympic-level skills and zero hesitation about shooting over their friends' heads. So, back to the big question, is it safer to be in front of the archers or behind them? Surprisingly, history leans toward none of the above. Being a target for enemy arrows was obviously bad news, but being too close to your own missile troops also came with real danger. One bad volley, and you might end up writing a letter home explaining why you got a dent in the helmet from a friendly arrow. That's why commanders would often place archers and artillery on higher ground or behind the main battle lines to maximize their range and effectiveness while minimizing the risk of hitting their own forces. The safest place was wherever you were least likely to be mistaken for the enemy and well away from the wildest part of the fight. Now, not all ranged troops were created equal. Some specialized archers trained their full lives. Think of Cretan or Scythian bowmen, who built legendary reputations for hitting targets from distances that made rivals nervous. But the average archer was just that, average. The odds of scoring a movie-style last-second shot that saves the day were slim at the best of times. You might expect there was some secret ancient method for knowing how not to hit your buddies, but mostly, it came down to common sense and plenty of trial and error. The effectiveness of archers and artillery was not simply a matter of aiming and firing. It was a strategic decision influenced by terrain, enemy formations, and weather conditions. That meant a good commander paid attention to the wind, made sure units had enough space, and told his archers to wait for the right moment instead of just letting fly for dramatic effect. All this gave a real edge to the commanders who actually knew what they were doing. A clever leader would walk the field, pick out the best spots for archers, and time their volleys to avoid confusion. In the heat of battle, though, plans often fell apart. A change in wind or a sudden push by enemy cavalry, and even the most careful strategy, could go sideways. The real challenge wasn't firing the arrows, it was keeping everyone safe and keeping the chaos in check. Of course, you didn't need a college degree in physics or meteorology to launch a few arrows and hope for the best. But those moments, when friendly fire caused chaos, still left commanders wishing they'd stuck to hand-to-hand fighting. The movies will keep rolling slow-motion arrow shots, but the next time you see a perfect volley soar over the heads of brave warriors, just remember, on a real ancient battlefield, nobody wanted to be behind, or in front of, an army's own archers. And those arrows weren't the only thing ancient soldiers had to worry about. As soon as horses entered the mix, the odds of chaos went way up, especially when Hollywood's armored knights start their thunderous charges. Picture it, a movie battlefield shrouded in morning mist, the ground trembling, and suddenly, here come the knights, charging across open fields, lances pointed like medieval missiles. It looks like nothing could stop them. Steel-clad titans on horses, charging as if the laws of physics are taking the day off. If Hollywood did history's homework, every battle would be over as soon as these guys decided to run at something. But let's hold on. Did knights on horseback really steamroll medieval armies every time? Or are movie charges the action hero version of what was, in reality, one seriously risky gamble? To get why these scenes stick around, you've got to admit, there is something magical about a horse charge on film. You have banners snapping in the wind, armor flashing, hooves pounding in harmony. It taps right into the fantasy that bigger, faster, and louder always wins. Movie directors use every camera trick to make it feel like the cavalry is a medieval war's cheat code. But charging across a field wasn't just about galloping forward and waiting for the dust to clear. Knights didn't just pick up a lance, shout a family motto, and barrel ahead for glory. In real battles, things could, and did, go wrong fast. The main problem is pretty basic. Horses are not motorcycles. They don't speed up, stay straight, or handle like sports cars. Even the best-trained warhorses needed steady nerves, and they weren't nearly as eager as actors make them look on screen. Horses have what you might call a strong sense of self-preservation. Expecting a horse to run headlong into sharp spears or a spiky barricade isn't just wishful thinking. It's almost impossible to command. And when you put dozens or hundreds of these animals together, the odds of somebody getting spooked or veering off course only go up. That's the first hole in the unstoppable cavalry idea. There's also the small matter of everything that could get in the way: mud, rocks, ditches, and lost equipment. The speed of the horse, the specific tactics employed by the knights, and the nature of the terrain all played crucial roles in determining the outcome of a charge. Fields covered in thick mud quickly turned a cavalry run into a comedy of sliding armor and thrown riders. Horses can't charge full speed through thick muck, and knights knew it. It's no accident that some of the most famous failed charges in history happened during rainstorms or on churned-up ground. Even when the field was dry, someone's forgotten campfire pit or a hidden hole could send a knight sailing headfirst. Not exactly the epic moment anyone's aiming for. Now, take a look at how cavalry was actually used when it mattered. Knights didn't always rush in at full speed. Knights often employed a variety of tactics beyond the frontal charge. These included a frontal charge followed by a turn just before hitting the enemy, dismounting to engage the enemy on foot, utilizing ranged weapons, or attempting to encircle the enemy. The full-speed charge you see in movies is just one trick in the bag, and not even the most common one. Smart commanders arranged their troops so that cavalry could attack from the sides or pounce on a scattered enemy trying to run away. Sometimes, just the threat of a charge was enough to scare an enemy into breaking ranks before anyone hit the gas. And don't forget about the other side. Foot soldiers weren't passive targets. Medieval armies made life miserable for cavalry by bristling with spears, pikes, and other long, pointy objects. If you've ever seen a lineup of polearms, you know why horses would hesitate. A direct charge against well-fortified infantry was a risky move, and knights often employed alternative methods of attack. Formations like the Scottish Schiltron or the Swiss pike square turned the front line into a solid hedge that even the boldest horse didn't want to bump into. Infantry drilled to receive a charge sometimes braced themselves so well that all the knights' momentum did was leave them flopping around on their backs. In other words, cavalry was powerful, but far from a magic bullet. Hollywood also wants you to believe that every knight is a one-man army, slicing through infantry with a sword as long as your arm. Here's the twist. Swords, often overrepresented in film, were not the primary weapon in medieval warfare. Swords were expensive to produce, and primarily available to the wealthiest fighters. Medieval armies utilized a variety of weapons, including spears, pikes, and halberds, which offered greater reach. Swords were effective in close-quarters combat, but less so against plate armor, which was specifically designed to offer more protection. That means most knights and soldiers went into battle with whatever worked, and that usually meant polearms when they could get them. Battle diagrams from the period make this crystal clear. Picture a block of infantry locking shields, pikes thrust in front, with cavalry circling like sharks, looking for weak points rather than taking a head-on ride into the blender. Sometimes, knights even got off their horses to fight on foot, safer and more effective than trying to crash through a forest of wooden spikes. When charges did happen, they were timed for maximum effect, hitting an enemy that was already tired out of formation or broken in spirit. Charging fresh, organized infantry was usually avoided unless desperation left no other option. To see how this played out in history, let's talk about some failed charges. At the Battle of Courtrai in 1302, heavily armored French knights charged a lineup of Flemish militia, farmers and tradesmen with long spears. The knights hit a marshy patch, floundered in the mud, and got picked off by men who'd probably rather be anywhere else. No heroics, no unstoppable wave, just a bad day for expensive armor and an even worse one for horses. Another jaw-dropping mess happened at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, when English cavalry charged uphill and got tangled with Scottish spearmen. The knights lost momentum, stumbled over each other, and the Scots showed just how quickly a horse charge could be turned into a medieval stampede. The problem with horses isn't just about courage, either. Horses ate a ton, cost even more, and took years to train. They were rarely thrown away on suicide missions. Smart knights used their horses to get to the part of the battlefield where they mattered, then did the rest of the dirty work on foot. As armor got heavier and pikes got longer, the balance kept tipping away from glorious cavalry attacks and toward battles that looked more like high-stakes shoving matches than Hollywood's thunderous charges. There were moments when the charge did its job. A routed enemy or poorly armored troops might fall apart in the face of a sudden, organized wave of cavalry. But for every cinematic victory, there were plenty of sad trombone moments, where knights ended up floundering in ditches, sliding across slick grass, or turned back by an army that just knew how to plant a spear. The other issue movies rarely cover is just how much communication and training it took to make a charge work. Horses needed to ride in formation, knights needed to coordinate their speed, and everyone had to stay roughly together. Otherwise, the charge lost its punch before it even hit the line. There's a reason why medieval armies spent plenty of time practicing in the safety of a field before ever trying anything dangerous in battle. The whole bit about raising your lance and hoping for the best fits movies, not actual fighting. Armor, while impressive, wasn't invulnerable. Plate armor was specifically designed to stop slashing blades and blunt force, but it wasn't always a guarantee. It covered most vital spots, but horses, joints, and faces remained vulnerable. And smashing into pikes at 30 kilometers an hour, it tested the limits of gear and courage. By the late medieval period, even the most impressive suits weren't much help against a wall of steel-tipped sticks or a well-timed volley of arrows. Knights who survived a failed charge usually had their armor and their pride badly dented. Ranged weapons mattered here, too. Even if the cavalry timed the charge perfectly, a well-aimed barrage of arrows or crossbow bolts could make the best-laid plans fall apart fast. Some commanders would wait to unleash their arrows until the last possible second, hoping to take out horses or unseat riders just before the lines met. If you watch how movies arrange cavalry, the line stretching horizon to horizon, nothing but blue sky in front, you miss how often knights had to dodge, weave, and pick their targets with care. So, every time a movie lights up a field with that classic cavalry charge, remember, real horses, just like real soldiers, were careful, skittish, and aware of when it was smarter to turn than smash. The glory and drama of a full-speed charge looked great on camera, but real battles were about tactics, patience, and knowing when running straight at the enemy was just a bad idea. Once you see medieval war from the muddy, uneven perspective of those who actually fought it, you'll never watch a cinematic horse charge and believe it again. The next time knights thunder across your screen, armor gleaming and lances at the ready, try picturing what's happening just out of frame. A patch of soggy ground, a hidden ditch, a row of determined farmers with pointy sticks, or a not-so-cooperative warhorse, thinking twice about risking its hide. That's medieval mayhem without the director's filter. The truth is far messier, and a lot more interesting, than 2 minutes of heroic slow motion can ever show. And if you think that's wild, just wait until we swap the open field for stone walls, siege towers, and boiling oil, because movie sieges are where Hollywood's wildest battle fantasies really go off the rails. If your only source for sieges is a movie, you'd expect every stone fortress to explode like there's a fireworks budget at stake. Thanks to Hollywood, we've all seen the big battering ram charge, the slow-motion fireball, and the straight-up cartoon chaos of a single gate crumbling while everyone cheers. It looks cool, but if you try to line up movie sieges with real history, you're in for a shock, because what actually happened wasn't even close to a highlight reel. Let's talk about what sieges really meant on the ground. For most people trapped inside or outside those stone walls, the big event wasn't some dramatic final attack. It was weeks, sometimes months, of slow misery. Sieges were basically contests of who could be more stubborn. The defenders huddled behind walls, counting sacks of flour, and the attackers camped in muddy fields, worrying about whether their own supplies would run out before anyone blinked. Disease and starvation were way bigger threats than a burning battering ram ever was. In real sieges, you mostly waited for morale to break, for a well to dry up, or for the enemy to finally give up. Patience was the real siege weapon, not some catapult that could break a wall in a single swing. Movies always skipped the slow parts. Instead of weeks of boredom, nerve-wracking silence, or the constant fear of dysentery, Hollywood hits fast forward right to the good stuff. The slow grind of a siege, the negotiations, threats, feasts turning into rationing, and people inventing new ways to cook shoe leather, just isn't as cinematic as a giant explosion. You don't see the day-by-day breakdown. As food runs out, people start arguing about whose turn it is to keep watch, or someone gets desperate enough to risk sneaking out for water. The focus on action-packed events in film really misrepresents the protracted and grueling nature of real sieges, which were characterized by disease, starvation, and the slow erosion of defenses. Instead of a single hero's charge, the real challenge was just making it through the next day. The story wasn't about who could swing a sword the hardest. It was about who could stomach sleeping on stone floors for a month while keeping hope alive that someone, anyone, might show up to break the siege. If you pull up a real siege diagram, the differences pop out fast. Forget straightforward walls and a single big door ready to be smashed in. Defensive works were all about layers. Ditches in front of the main wall to trap ladders and carts, wooden platforms to funnel attackers into kill zones, hidden gates, and countless simple, but nasty tricks. Ditches forced attackers to build ramps or fill them in under fire, while defenders dumped rocks or worse from above. You might have seen movie scenes where wood pitch is poured out and lit on fire, but boiling oil was a real hazard. The real winner wasn't the guy with the biggest muscles, but the one whose breakfast didn't get ruined by a surprise bucket of scalding animal fat. And then there were the siege engines, catapults, ballistae, and all manner of medieval Rube Goldberg devices, drilled down into real accounts, and it's clear these machines did more than just break walls. They were meant to terrify defenders and make every morning unpredictable. Here's a lovely detail from Josephus: a catapult's ability to tear off a soldier's head, emphasizing the brutal effectiveness of siege weaponry. Not exactly family-friendly, but historically spot-on. While Hollywood goes for perfect aim and ever-present explosions, the truth is these weapons fired massive rocks and deadly bolts at whatever, and whoever, was unlucky enough to be caught on the other side. Sometimes a giant stone would just plop harmlessly in a courtyard. Other times it might smash an entire house, or, as Josephus saw, send helmets flying with no warning. But not every moment of siege warfare was about heavy machinery. Some of the ugliest tactics were hidden underground. Attackers dug long tunnels, called saps, right up to the walls, trying to weaken the foundations and make entire sections collapse. Defenders weren't about to just sit around. They tunneled right back, hoping to intercept the enemy, set fire to wooden supports, or cause a cave-in. Sometimes these tunnel battles got so brutal they turned into blind, underground wrestling matches, miners swinging hammers and torches in claustrophobic darkness. The escalation didn't stop there. The use of early chemical warfare, burning sulfur and bitumen to create poisonous smoke, turned tunnels into death traps, and all of this happened out of sight from the chaos above. The magic of movie explosions can't do justice to the horror of realizing the air around you had just turned deadly. Gross tricks were the norm. Defenders chucked everything from rocks to dead animals and garbage over the walls. If you imagine medieval recycling, sieges were it. Anything to break morale on the other side. Sometimes, attackers catapulted carcasses into fortified cities, hoping disease would do what arrows and axes couldn't. Disease almost always showed up as a third army, invisible but ruthless. With clean water hard to find and waste piling up, typhus, dysentery, and the plague often became the biggest killers for both sides. This wasn't the stuff of epic music and flaming battering rams. It was the slow work of fear, hunger, and fatigue. Now look at how Hollywood packages these months of tension and filth. Movies tend to condense weeks or months of hardship, negotiation, and attrition into brief moments of chaos, overlooking the true nature of sieges, which were more about endurance and strategic patience than decisive battles. Films like Kingdom of Heaven give you impressive visuals, huge battle lines, and dramatic speeches, but behind the scenes, the slow grind of weak food, sharp words, and failing ladders does more to break armies than any single explosion. Kingdom of Heaven does try, in its own way, to hint at the complexity, showing supply lines, different defensive strategies, and complicated walls, even if it throws in a few creative liberties for good measure. Once in a while, a film actually gets close to showing what a siege felt like, without needing an action hero. The film Masada offers a more realistic portrayal of siege warfare, depicting the Roman siege of the fortress of Masada. The film includes small skirmishes that are done fairly realistically, offering a more accurate depiction of the tactics and challenges involved in a siege. In Masada, the tension is all about whether the Romans will finish their giant ramp, not about whether someone can light just the right amount of hay on fire. If you want a view that trades big moments for raw exhaustion, Masada is the movie to watch. Siege warfare deeply depended on engineering more than bravery. Attackers were always building ramps, towers, and screens to protect themselves from everything raining down. Defenders repaired walls at night, blocked tunnels, and tried to outthink the invaders. Every move was about buying a little more time. Some sieges even ended in deals. After months of hardship, one side would simply give in. The moment of surrender might be a quiet handshake or a silent, disappointed slip out the back gate. If you want gross details, poison and filth played a huge part. As if starvation weren't bad enough, everyone had to live with the smell of unwashed bodies, rotting waste, and the constant threat of the next disease outbreak. The burning sulfur and bitumen to create poisonous smoke trick wasn't just a one-off. Sometimes, sieges became contests to see who could make life more unbearable for the other side without direct fighting. Survival became a mix of luck, resourcefulness, and pure stubbornness. Glory didn't enter into it. On the rare days when an actual assault happened, attackers often faced ditches filled with sharp stakes or water, ramparts taller than expected, and wave after wave of arrows and rocks. It wasn't just classic boiling oil either. Sometimes defenders set traps with burning sand, tar, or anything hot enough to ruin your day. The instant chaos of movie sieges skips all the waiting and just shows the raid. The reality of siege warfare involved a diverse range of tactics and engineering feats, including the construction of ditches, walls, and the use of simple but effective tools like boiling oil. Siege engines could do a lot, but no single device was a magic key. Most rams and towers took weeks to build. Every new piece of tech brought new creative responses from the defenders. If a battering ram started knocking at the door, defenders countered with everything from spiked chains to sticky pitch. When attackers got a siege tower close enough to a wall, chances were high that someone inside was dousing it with oil, setting it on fire, or cutting the ropes. And the entire time, both sides watched the supply counters tick down, knowing whoever ran out of food or water first would probably lose their nerve. If you stepped into the middle of a real siege, the true nature of sieges were more about endurance and strategic patience than decisive battles. A good chunk of the pain happened long before the gate ever splintered. Bad food, missing sleep, and endless fear that tonight would be the last night. When the final attack finally came, it was more mop-up than movie climax. Defenders, already half dead from hunger or disease, often gave up the fight before swords even crossed. So, what's left when the smoke clears and the walls finally fall? The survivors stumble out, not as heroes, but as people who've just lived through one of the most miserable experiences history can offer. The movies will always favor blazing gates and flying rocks, but if you've made it through a real siege, the only explosion you remember is the hunger in your belly or the stench in your clothes. Next time you see a film where a siege gets wrapped up with a single well-timed blast, picture all the unseen weeks of planning, tunneling, starvation, and sheer filth. There's a reason so few sieges ended in blaze of glory stories. After living through months of misery, disease, and attrition, most survivors weren't looking for a victory speech. They just wanted a meal, a warm bed, and a long bath. That's the real story behind those towering walls, muddy ditches, and battered gates, and it's one Hollywood rarely ever shows. Now, siege survivors didn't get much time to savor their escape, because even once the gates came down, the real madness was just beginning. The chaos as commanders scrambled to impose order, or just hung on for dear life. If you only watched Hollywood epics, you might leave thinking every ancient general strolled along the nearest cliff, gazing down with a perfect bird's-eye view of the battlefield, chessboard style. In every big film, kings, commanders, or mystical wizards yell from a hilltop, and, like magic, thousands of soldiers snap into action, forming lines, turning on a dime, and marching toward glory the second the general waves an arm or drops a cryptic command. Flags wave, trumpets blare, messengers race back and forth, and the whole army seems to respond like one well-oiled machine. That's the movie version anyway. In reality, if a general got through a battle without losing half his plans, his voice, or his mind, it was a good day. Let's get a grip on what commanders really faced when two big armies crashed together. First, there's the crushing reality that any big fight created instant chaos. Noise exploded on all sides, trumpets blasting orders, soldiers yelling, horses neighing, weapons smacking shields. The chaotic nature of ancient battles severely limited a commander's ability to maintain situational awareness. Soldiers fought for their own survival and stuck close to the folks beside them, hoping the confusion stayed elsewhere. Forget seeing everything from above. A general stuck on the ground might only see as far as the next body or the nearest standard, and maybe hear only the loudest voice in the mess. Visual aids show the mess pretty well. On a real battlefield, there might be thousands of people crowded into a single open field, with dust and smoke swirling everywhere. If you set a drone camera overhead, the neat movie lines would vanish pretty quickly into swirls of color and clumps of movement. Even the sharpest commander, perched on the highest horse, couldn't see what was happening at the far ends of his line, not to mention what the enemy was doing out of sight behind their own front. Most decisions had to be made with just a narrow slice of the picture. How did commanders even try to fix this mess? There were two main styles on offer. The first is sometimes called general command. The leader, often a king or noble, led by example right in the thick of it, sword in hand, shouting until his voice went hoarse. This approach looked good for troop morale, especially if you liked the idea of being seen in the action. But here's the catch. With so much happening around you and half the army spread out down the line, there's no way to direct what's going on beyond arm's reach. All those plans from the opening council tent, they usually got lost as soon as arrows started flying. The people around the commander might fight harder or panic faster, but the big picture got blurry real quick. The other style was battle manager. Instead of charging in, the commander hung back, sending out messengers and signals, non-stop traffic by horse, foot, or trumpet, to try and coordinate the chaos. In theory, this meant you could move your pieces and respond to threats wherever they showed up. In practice, the system was as reliable as a rumor at a market. Communication on the ancient battlefield was severely limited. Trumpets were used to convey commands, but their effectiveness was hampered by the noise and confusion of combat. Messengers could get lost, caught, or simply misunderstood. A note, meant to tell the cavalry to wait, might instead launch them into the melee. A missed trumpet call in the wind could leave an entire wing standing still, watching their allies get swamped. Even visual signals carried their own risks. Banners and flags were good when the field was open and everyone knew what to look for. Change the weather, add fog, rain, or the debris of a ruined town, and the system fell apart. The heat of battle produced so much dust that a commander might lose sight of his own standard. If confusion set in, a single misplaced color or accidental move could send troops running the wrong way, sometimes straight into a friend's spear. And if the enemy captured or copied your banner, the results went from confusing to disastrous. The downside of ballooning army sizes was clear. Commanders could only directly address those immediately beside them, and the spread of information relied on soldiers' ability to react to the actions of those in front. So if you were that ancient general, what choices did you really have when chaos started eating your plan alive? You relied on one basic principle: trust. Trust that your officers remembered the main goal, trust that your messengers could run, or ride, through a nightmare, and trust that your soldiers would copy their neighbors if nothing else. Pre-battle was the time to drill everyone on what could go wrong. If A happens, do B. If the line breaks, pull back to the big oak. If you can't hear orders, find the nearest banner. It was military insurance against the world's worst game of telephone. Of course, history is packed with battles where none of this worked. Sometimes generals gave up trying to micromanage and just hoped that the initial setup would hold long enough to finish the job. That's why battles were won or lost by the strength, discipline, and instincts of soldiers as much as by any genius plan. It's like putting on a huge school play where everyone gets the script, but the moment the curtain rises, half the cast forgets their lines and 3 kids wander offstage looking for snacks. But let's step into a couple of actual scenarios. Picture a commander sending infantry forward, waiting for the right moment to unleash the cavalry. Suddenly, something changes. A gap opens up in the line, but it's all the way down the flank. From the general's position, it could look like progress, disaster, or just a cloud of dust. Maybe he tosses a flag for a new maneuver, or blasts the trumpet for close ranks. But 24 things get in the way. Troops can't hear, messenger takes a wrong turn, or maybe the drummer down the line starts beating to the wrong rhythm. In the time it takes to fix one mix-up, another one pops up further down. Realistically, commanders spend as much time reacting to accidents as sticking to their original plan. So what happened when the whole idea fell apart? Improvisation. The best commanders weren't the ones who wrote the smartest battle plan, but the ones who could adjust it on the fly, changing formation, plugging holes, or deciding on a retreat before panic swept the line. Going in with a perfect script rarely mattered by the halfway mark. The trick was spotting disaster early and making the bold decision to cut losses, shift units, or rally fresh reserves. Sometimes even the most famous generals, yes, including Julius Caesar himself, got things wrong, lost track of half their army, and found success only because their soldiers and junior officers kept the basics in mind and took initiative. Don't let movies trick you into believing every general could see the whole chessboard, either. Ancient and medieval battles meant working with severe limitations in communication, visibility, and the inherent chaos of battle, making it difficult to grasp the overall situation. The so-called big picture was, in most cases, a patchwork of guesses, lucky breaks, and frantic updates from whoever ran in with the best news, worst news, or just the loudest voice. Some of the cleverer operations were planned ahead using landmarks. Move when you see the burning barn. Attack when the sun is over the hill. Hold back until the trumpets sound twice. These weren't foolproof. In fact, they were full of holes, but they gave armies at least a fighting chance at moving together when it counted. The rest was up to fate, weather, and the ability to improvise when the opening plan fell apart, which was nearly every time. Cinematic history loves to show a general's moment of glory, looking over perfect lines from the back of a horse, a finger pointing to signal the next big move. But for real commanders, victory relied less on single strokes of genius and more on quick thinking, stubborn nerves, and a mountain of luck. The effectiveness of either approach was heavily influenced by the specific circumstances of the battle and the training of the troops. Genius plans might have looked good before the arrows flew, but they only lasted until the first mix-up hit the line. If you want a rare example of a movie that edges closer to truth, look way outside the ancient world to the film _Tora. Tora _ the film stands out because its accuracy is a result of the extensive use of models and special effects, and it tries to show how confusion and cross-communication played a role in real events. Even so, modern weapons and radios gave those commanders a luxury no Roman or medieval leader ever had. Battlefield command in reality was messy, improvisational, and always on the edge of falling apart. Generalship could win a day, but nobody, no matter how famous, had absolute control once the dust kicked up and the shouting started. Success counted on the army's preparation and every soldier's split-second choice, not just the plan printed on a tent flap. As a result, ancient commanders prayed for good weather, trusted a lot to instinct, and woke up every morning hoping luck was on their side. The next time you see a movie general scanning the field with perfect clarity, remember, most of history's big winners just guessed right a little more often than their enemies did. And when it comes to battles on the big screen, some rare films actually manage to capture a touch of this. Directors who listen to real experts, line their armies up right, and let the mess show through. So, which movies actually pass the test and win an historian's approval? Let's shine a light on some Hollywood battles that, for once, get the details right. It's easy to roast Hollywood for how it twists history into popcorn-friendly chaos, but not all movies are guilty of pure nonsense. Some directors put in the work, listen to expert advisors, and actually give historians a reason to sit up in their seats instead of hiding behind their popcorn. Think about it. Every now and then, a battle scene rolls on screen that feels less like a fireworks show and more like a window into the real past. These moments stick out not just for flashy swords or giant armies, but for the little things, familiar maneuvers, accurate formations, and, dare I say, a few scenes where soldiers behave like actual humans who'd rather not get skewered in the first 5 minutes. Let's start with Alexander, 2004. Oliver Stone's take on the king with the world's biggest ego has sparked 1,000 debates, but when it comes to the Battle of Gaugamela, even the pickiest historians have given it a cautious thumbs up. Dr. Roel Konijnendik, an ancient historian at Oxford, called the battle scenes pretty much spot on to how it really happened. He's not blowing smoke. You watch Alexander's cavalry sweep around the edge, the Macedonian phalanxes shifting their spears into a lethal hedgehog, and it doesn't feel like slow-motion movie magic for a change. It's choreography that's rooted in what real armies tried to do. You see those long lines pivot, spines straight and shields overlapping, and suddenly the math of the battle makes sense. A wall that bends, flexes, and delivers the punch exactly where Alexander wanted. There's a reason this film feels closer to a documentary sometimes. Robin Lane Fox, who knows more about Alexander the Great than most people know about their own cousins, was right there, making sure everything looked and felt real. In fact, he trained actual Moroccan soldiers for the film's army scenes. If you pay attention, there's real satisfaction watching these extras turn into soldiers who move like they've practiced for years, not a collection of tourists, given plastic helmets, and told to look angry. The benefit comes out most in those big panoramic sweeps. No loose ends, no extras playing with their spears in the back row, just the sort of discipline that gave Macedon a real edge and kept the Persians guessing. That's not just movie flair. It's what happened when you shoved a group of scared, well-drilled men onto a field and told them the fate of the world was on the line. If you're more of a TV person, HBO's Rome is worth a second look. The opening scene, where Roman soldiers form up just outside a Gaulish town, sets the tone. Instead of movie chaos, you see troops listening, following orders, and, get this, not racing off for individual glory. There's a sense of the slow, careful rhythm that real soldiers followed. The front rank holds, then swaps out for fresh men, just as historians believe was standard. Floods of spears don't shatter the line in a single volley. There's exhaustion, hesitation, and the hassle of fighting as a team, sometimes boring, always dirty, and never as tidy as a director might wish. The show even nails the details that don't make for good posters. Men tightening their armor, sergeants barking last-minute advice, and everyone jostling for the least risky spot in the bunch. The magic of this scene is that it puts you right in the dirt, shoulder to shoulder, with tired Romans who probably would rather get on with it and go home. The series accurately depicts Roman soldiers following commands, working as a group, and maintaining discipline and close order. The principle of swapping the front rank, HBO doesn't skip it, either. Instead, it gets shown on screen, and the result is a line that actually stays together. No star turn. No wild chaos, just the sort of grind that wins or loses, real battles. The opening moments show order under pressure. There's shouting. The lines do waver, but it feels earned, not just thrown in for noise. Sometimes, though, you want a film that brings something different to the table. A battle where the sides don't match in numbers or technology, but tactics turn the tide. Enter Zulu, 1964. The whole film builds up to a showdown between a few hundred red-coated British soldiers, stuck in a tiny mission station, and thousands of Zulu warriors, with every intention of smashing through those thin lines. The best part? You actually see both sides thinking. No cartoon bad guys, no faceless others. The Zulus line up in their trademark bullhorn formation, and you even catch a glimpse of how their strategy was meant to swallow opponents from the flanks. The British, meanwhile, don't just stand in one lump and hope for the best. They kneel, fire in 3 precise ranks, and keep the tempo steady. Load, aim, shoot, repeat. It's not just for show. This is how the British Army actually fired, maximizing every inch of those old rifles and covering to compensate for their own short numbers. There isn't some over-the-top last stand music overtaking every shot. The tension is in the faces and the formations, not the pyrotechnics. The film shows how even under pressure, trained troops fall back on drill and group effort. The Zulus, for their part, make use of their environment, probing for weaknesses instead of just charging at walls like lemmings. This is what battle looked like when both sides respected their opponents and let tactics, not just raw strength, decide the outcome. The film accurately depicts the bullhorn formation of the Zulus and the 3-deep fire-by rank of the British. Even the mess, the confusion, and the sweat hit closer to reality than most historical films ever bother with. Emmy at bay. Now, battles didn't just happen on dry land. If you want to see what naval warfare was really like, Master and Commander, The Far Side of the World, 2003, offers a model for how to do ship combat right. Forget the pirate movies with cannonballs neatly bouncing between perfectly lined ships. The real Napoleonic Navy brought fear, noise, and with splinters flying at dangerous speed. The filmmakers shot much of it on the open sea, so the waves, the deck tilts, and the barely controlled chaos are more than just good camera work. They're about as close as you'll get to the real thing without a time machine. You notice sailors scrambling to patch holes and manage the rigging, all with the creaking wood and crash of water underneath. Nobody is choreographing a duel on the bowsprit. Instead, the whole crew pitches in to keep the ship afloat and the enemy at bay. The strategy isn't just about shooting first. You see positioning, wind direction, and boarding parties in all their mess and panic. In one of the film's sharpest moments, there's a split-second decision, run or fight, before the battle truly begins. Those sorts of choices decided the fate of huge fortunes and whole fleets, but rarely do they get a proper spotlight in big-budget movies. The chaos isn't cleaned up, either. The ship combat was definitely realistically scary. When cannonballs rip through the hull, there's no heroic pause for reflection. Just sailors scrambling, buckets of water pouring, and everyone hoping the next hit doesn't end the day for good. It's not just about the fighting, either. The boredom, nerves, and split-second changes in fortune play as big a role as any sword fight or cannon blast. It's the kind of film where you see what made real sailors and captains tick, worry about supplies, storms, and the 1,000 small decisions that keep a crew alive. By choosing grit and accuracy over spectacle, the filmmakers did what most history buffs only dream of. They made tactics into the star, and the result is a story that rings true, not just loud. There's something satisfying about spotting the difference between blockbuster energy and authenticity. Interviews with historians often point out these standout moments, highlighting how detailed choreography or expert consultation made the difference between just another brawl and a battle worthy of classroom discussion. Each film on this list shares a common thread: directors who didn't treat the truth like an annoying chore. Instead, they took expert advice seriously, whether it was in how soldiers moved in formation, the way a commander used terrain, or the tiny habits that made or broke an army's lines. Sometimes, the historians even confess the movies outsmarted the textbooks. Visual storytelling can bring details to life better than any written record, as long as the people in charge care enough to get it right. If you've been keeping tabs on which films embarrass their extras with fake armor and wild acrobatics, now you have a short list to bring to your next movie night. These aren't the stories that sugarcoat the battlefield or promise easy victories with a single heroic charge. They let you see how discipline, teamwork, and a bit of luck made the difference, not just for the generals, but for every soldier who had to trust the man beside him and hope the real enemy was always in front, not behind. With battle scenes that let the actual military logic shine through, you get something rare in Hollywood. A reason to watch with both eyes open. Put these films on your list if you want to impress your favorite history teacher, win a trivia contest, or just enjoy a little less nonsense next time you watch a siege or showdown play out. For once, you won't have to roll your eyes or shout at the screen when a phalanx moves as a solid block, or cannonballs behave the way actual cannonballs do. The more you watch, the more the real challenges and strategies underneath all that clashing steel and thundering hooves become visible. And once you know what accuracy looks like, it's pretty tough to go back to the over-the-top battles that put entertainment first and leave history in the mud. Next time you watch a big battle on screen, you'll see past the shiny costumes and slow-motion charges. Hollywood loves turning history into a simple, noisy mess, but most real combat was full of worry about food supply, muddled communication, and teamwork that didn't always work out. The chaotic nature of ancient battles severely limited a commander's ability to maintain situational awareness. If you want to unravel more myths, or have a battle you want Hollywood to fix, hit subscribe and leave a comment. History rarely matches the movies, but the mess makes for better stories anyway.